The desert doesn't forgive you for being unprepared. That's not a metaphor. That's just Arizona in August, where the asphalt on Route 60 gets soft enough by 2 in the afternoon that your boot heel leaves a print, where the air coming off the scrubland smells like hot iron and something older, something the Sonoran Desert has been cooking for 10,000 years before a single house or highway interrupted its silence. Phoenix sits in the middle of all that, a city that shouldn't exist by any reasonable measure of geography or logic. Yet here it is, sprawling and relentless, chrome and adobe and strip malls selling everything from custom exhaust systems to salvation, sometimes in the same parking lot. Rafe McCallum had driven these streets for 35 years. He knew every scar in the asphalt, every intersection where the light timing was off by 2 seconds, where the gravel gathered at the edge of the turn, where the summer heat created that shimmer on the blacktop that looked like water and wasn't. He knew this city the way a man knows something he has chosen, not because it was easy, but because it was his. He was 58 years old. 25 of those years, he'd worn the patch. The name on the back of the cut said McCallum, but out here on these roads in the places where his name actually carried weight, they called him Ironside. There was a story behind that name. Most men who'd heard it knew better than to ask. The ones who didn't know better, well, they usually only asked once. It was a Saturday morning in late August when everything changed. Not with a bang, not with the kind of dramatic rupture that marks the beginning of stories in the movies. It started the way most of life's genuine catastrophes begin, quietly sideways, while you were paying attention to something else entirely. Rafe was in the parking lot of the clubhouse on the east side of Phoenix, crouched down beside a 1972 Sportster that belonged to a prospect named Brendan Shea, and he was not happy. Brendan was 23 years old, second-generation Irish-American, with a jaw like a shovel and the kind of hands that were built for mechanical work, wide palms, thick fingers, the sort that could torque a bolt by feel alone once they learned what they were doing. He had potential. Rafe could see it. But potential and execution were two different countries, and right now, Brendan was standing on the wrong side of the border. Rafe pulled a rag from the back pocket of his jeans, wiped down the carburetor float bowl he'd just pulled, held it up to the morning light. "You see this?" Brendan leaned in. "The residue, the varnish." Rafe's voice was the kind of voice that didn't need volume to be heard. It had texture, gravel and years. You let fuel sit in a carburetor too long, it turns to varnish, clogs the jets. Engine runs rough, stumbles, a throttle eventually quits on you. He set the float bowl on a clean shop rag. "You know when that usually happens?" Brendan shook his head. "Highway, 70 miles an hour, middle of nowhere." Rafe looked up at him. "Because that's when everything fails. Not in the parking lot, not when you're going slow. When you need the machine most, that's when neglect makes itself known." He began cleaning the float bowl with patient, deliberate strokes, not hurrying, not performing, just doing the thing correctly the way it deserved to be done. "Engines are honest," Rafe continued. "They don't lie. They don't pretend to be something they're not. You put bad fuel in, you get bad performance out. You skip maintenance, you pay for it later, every single time." He set down the rag. "Most men treat their machines the way they treat everything else in their lives. They run them hard, ignore the warning signs, and then act surprised when things fall apart." He handed the float bowl to Brendan. "Clean it, brake cleaner, clean rag, every passage until you can see light through it. Then we reassemble." Brendan took it without a word. That was one of the things Rafe had noticed about the kid. He knew when to listen. Not everyone did, not even the ones who'd been around a long time. The morning was still cool by Phoenix standards, maybe 92 degrees. The sun was still climbing, not yet at the angle where it turned the world into a furnace, and in the relative mercy of that window, the parking lot had a particular quality. The smell of hot asphalt beginning to wake up motor oil on concrete. The faint memory of the previous night's barbecue still hanging in the air around the picnic tables at the far end of the lot. He reached into the breast pocket of his vest and pulled out a pocket watch. Brass, worn smooth at the edges from 30 years of being taken out and put back thousands of times. The case had a small dent on the lower left from a road incident in 2003 that Rafe didn't talk about much, the one that had put him in a hospital bed for 6 weeks and given him the name Ironside. But it still kept perfect time. He'd had it serviced twice in 30 years. Wouldn't use anything else. He turned it over in his palm. The inscription on the back was worn, but still readable if you knew what you were looking for. "Every mile matters. Nora McCallum." His mother had given it to him the day he got his license. He'd been 17 years old. She'd pressed it into his hand with both of hers, her hands that smelled like rosewater, and dish soap that had braided his hair when he was small and later stitched up his knuckles when he was too proud to go to the doctor. She'd held his hands in hers and said, "Every mile matters, Rafe, every single one. The ones going somewhere and the ones coming home." He'd thought he understood what she meant back then. He was 58 years old and he was only beginning to understand it now. He slipped the watch back into his pocket and turned to check Brendan's progress. The kid was working the passages with a patience that surprised him. Good sign. "When you're done with that," Rafe said, "torque the head bolts to spec. 65 foot-pounds, not 60, not 70. 65. And I'm going to check your work." "Yes, sir." "And Brendan." He waited until the kid looked up. "This machine is 43 years old. It's been around longer than you have. You treat it with that in mind." Inside the clubhouse, the Saturday meeting had already started. Cole Drummond was running through the logistics of the Veterans Charity Ride third weekend in September, which meant 3 weeks out, which meant the window for organizing was closing faster than most of the brothers had probably internalized yet. Cole was methodical. That was one of his gifts. He could take a complicated operation with 15 moving parts and map it out with a clarity that made it look simple, which was the most useful kind of intelligence there was. He was 55 years old, built low to the ground, and solid, the kind of solid that doesn't come from a gym, that comes from decades of use. 15 years Rafe's right hand. In all that time, Cole had never once questioned a call in public. In private was different. In private, Cole asked the questions that needed asking. That was the relationship, and both men knew it, and neither of them had ever needed to say so out loud. Rafe took his seat at the head of the table. 12 men around him, not boys. Men with the kind of faces that had been carved by weather and decisions, and the specific knowledge that only comes from having made both the right choices and the wrong ones and living with the consequences of each. Hands that knew wrenches and could quote torque specs and had also done things that Rafe had made peace with in the way you make peace with complicated truths, not by erasing them, but by understanding their context. The meeting covered logistics, route planning, safety protocols, hospital confirmation, which brothers would ride lead, who would handle sweep. It was unglamorous work. Nobody made a movie about the pre-ride committee meetings of a motorcycle club, about the budget spreadsheets and the coordination calls with hospital administration, and the argument about whether to add a second rest stop on the return leg. But this was the real work. This was what the patch actually meant when it meant something. Cole was explaining the route adjustment when Rafe's phone rang. He almost didn't answer. Club policy during meetings was no phones. He'd set that policy himself. But there was a tightening in his chest, subtle, the kind of thing a younger man might dismiss, and something that had no proper name made him hold up a hand. The room went quiet. He answered. "Mr. McCallum." The voice was professional, controlled. But underneath the training, something taut and urgent. "This is Kathleen Brody, EMT specialist with Phoenix Fire and Rescue. I'm calling about Nora McCallum. We have her in our ambulance. She suffered a stroke." The world didn't tilt dramatically. There was no cinematic swell of music, no slow motion, just a quiet shift in the density of the air around him. "Where are you?" "We're en route to Desert Springs Medical Center. Your mother was in her garden. A neighbor called 911. Mr. McCallum, I need to be direct with you. Her condition is critical. With stroke patients, time is..." "How long to the hospital?" "Under normal circumstances, 18 minutes. But sir..." A pause, the kind that carries weight. "We have a situation." Rafe was already standing. 12 sets of eyes tracked him. "What situation?" "We're stopped on Cedar Hill Boulevard. There's some kind of street racing event. The road is completely blocked. We've been here for 11 minutes. I've asked them to clear the road. They're refusing." The cold began in Rafe's chest and moved outward through his veins. Cedar Hill Boulevard was 6 minutes from the clubhouse at normal speed, which meant by the time Nora had gone down, waited for the ambulance, been loaded, transported to Cedar Hill, and been sitting there for 11 minutes, 28 minutes, had already passed. With a stroke, 28 minutes. "How many of them?" 20, maybe 30 modified cars. Kathleen paused. And in that pause, he heard something bleed through the professional composure. "They're treating this like a game, Mr. McCallum. I explained we have a critical patient, and one of them..." He heard it then, in the background, young, male, carrying the particular confidence of someone who has never been genuinely afraid. "Tell Granny to wait her turn. We're racing here." Laughter. Rafe was already at the door. The sound of 20 Harley-Davidson motorcycles starting simultaneously is not something you hear. It's something you feel. It travels through the ground before it reaches the air, a vibration that registers somewhere below the threshold of sound and above the threshold of warning, a frequency that some part of the human nervous system, the ancient part that remembers when large moving things meant danger, still responds to. Every time. They didn't scramble. They didn't rush. Rushing was for people who hadn't done this before. Cole had the formation called before Rafe even reached his bike. He didn't need to be told. That was the 15 years. Rafe straddled his Road King, a 2003 Heritage 64,000 miles on the odometer. 3 divorces, 2 surgeries, 1 encounter with the ATF that had lasted 11 months and ended with lawyers earning every dollar of their considerable fees. He and this machine had negotiated all of it. He knew it the way you know something you have put time and care into in your hands before you know it in your head. The engine came alive under him. He keyed his radio, kept his voice flat. Hammer, north intersection of Cedar Hill and 7th. Hold it. Nobody in, nobody out. Copy press. Chain, south side, same. On it. The formation rolled. Rafe rode point and thought about his mother. He thought about her at 7 in the morning in the Rose Garden. She was always out there by 7 before the heat started in the canvas gloves she'd owned for 30 years, the ones that had been restitched at the fingers twice and that she refused to replace. He thought about the phone call 3 days ago when she'd been watering and he could hear the hose in the background and she'd been humming old songs, the kind that predated their move from Galway to Phoenix in 1962, songs that existed in her voice, like something that bypassed time entirely. He thought about what she'd said the last time he'd asked her to think about moving somewhere closer, somewhere he could keep a better eye on things. She'd stopped humming. There'd been a silence. And then I changed your diapers, Rafe. I can handle living alone. He had not asked again. He was going to ask again. The phone rang. Kathleen Brody. Mr. McCallum? Something in her voice had frayed past its limits. We've lost engine power. The ambulance is dead. I've called for backup. The nearest available unit is 35 minutes away. He processed it the way he processed things that could not be undone. Clearly, completely, without the luxury of reaction. Your mother doesn't have 35 minutes. I'm 2 minutes away. He opened the throttle. Not reckless, he couldn't afford reckless. But he let the Road King run 70 in a 55, the city blurring at the edges of his vision. 2 minutes felt like geological time. He thought about Frank. He didn't want to think about Frank. But Frank came anyway the way he always did when Rafe's control was being tested. Frank McCallum, who died in a jail cell in 1979 at the age of 43, whose name Rafe had spent the better part of 40 years trying to outrun by being something different, something better, something that proved the apple could in fact fall far enough from the tree to become an entirely different variety of fruit. Don't become your father. It was the thing his mother had said to him in 100 different ways over 50 years. You've got his fire, boy. You don't have to let it burn the same way. He had tried, for so long that the trying had become part of who he was, woven into how he moved through the world, how he spoke, how he taught Brendan Shea about carburetors and what they meant about a man's character. He had built an entire identity out of the effort to be different from the ghost of a man he'd watched destroy everything he touched before the world finally took him. And right now, heading towards Cedar Hill Boulevard, with the throttle open, and something cold and ancient moving through his chest, Rafe McCallum was not certain he was going to be able to hold it. Cedar Hill Boulevard. He smelled it before he saw it, tire rubber and exhaust, and the particular aggressive loudness of modified engines tuned for acceleration, rather than longevity. Music from multiple sources, bass-heavy, designed to be felt rather than heard. The smell of energy drinks and the specific overconfidence of young men who believe at a cellular level that consequences are theoretical. The convoy came around the corner and the scene resolved itself. 26 cars, he counted automatically. Modified, lowered suspensions, aftermarket exhaust window, tint so dark it was illegal in most states. Scattered across both lanes of Cedar Hill like someone had overturned a box of toys. Entirely blocked. Not partially. Entirely. In the middle of it all, the ambulance sat silent. Emergency lights still rotating, red and white strobing in the afternoon heat, casting color on the surrounding cars with a desperate mechanical persistence, as if the lights themselves were still trying even after the engine had quit. Through the narrow windows in the rear, a shape was visible, someone moving, working compressed into urgency inside a metal box on a block street in 103-degree heat. Kathleen Brody. Still in there. Still working. Right now she was only a movement, a silhouette, a person fighting something inside a machine that had stopped cooperating, and what she was fighting was the clock. The convoy stopped, 20 engines idling. Then Rafe cut his engine. One by one the others followed. And the silence that came after was the loudest thing on Cedar Hill Boulevard. Young men turned. Phones came up automatically, the modern reflex, the way previous generations might have reached for a cigarette or a weapon, now they reach for the camera. Recording, broadcasting, transforming whatever was happening into content before they'd even decided what it was. He saw the kid immediately. You always saw the one in charge. 24 years old, maybe. Blonde, bleached blonder by the Arizona sun, a BMW M5 behind him that gleamed like it had been driven maybe 400 miles total. Expensive sneakers, a phone in his hand not recording live streaming in the camera light steady red. Mason Garrett, he would learn that name later. Right now, the kid was grinning at his phone talking to 18,000 people, and Rafe was walking toward him across a street that smelled like rubber and someone's worst decision. He stopped 6 feet away. "Son," his voice carried, not loud. It never needed to be loud. "That ambulance has my mother inside. You have 10 seconds to move your vehicle." Mason Garrett turned, looked at him with the evaluating glance of someone calculating audience reaction before their own, grinned wider, spoke to the phone first. "Chat, we got Hell's Angels showing up. This is about to get interesting." Then to Rafe, "Or what old man am I going to hit me on live stream? I got 18,000 witnesses." Rafe counted to 5 in his head. Old habit. His father used to count to 3 before he started swinging. Rafe had learned early that adding 2 seconds gave you something his father never had the space to think about what you actually wanted the next 5 minutes to look like. "I'm asking you nicely. Move the car. Let the ambulance through." "And I'm saying no." Mason spread his hands, performer's gesture. "This is a public street. We've got as much right to be here as any ambulance. Maybe Granny should have." "Don't." The word came out like a door closing. Not angry, something colder than angry. Officer Dana Kerr pulled up. She stepped out with the efficiency of someone who has been in this exact situation dozens of times and knows her ability to solve it is constrained by architecture she didn't design. 47 years old, 22 on the force. She looked at the ambulance, looked at Rafe, looked at Mason. "Son, I'm going to give you one chance. Move your vehicle." "Am I breaking any laws, officer?" Mason's voice carried the careful cadence of someone who had researched exactly this scenario. "I'm legally parked, not in a red zone, not blocking a hydrant. Those bikers, though, coming in formation, making threats, that's intimidation. I got it on video." Rafe and Dana Kerr exchanged a look, one of those looks that doesn't need translation. It carried the entire weight of the gap between what was right and what was legal, and the frustrating reality that those two things occupied different jurisdictions. She was handcuffed by procedure. They both knew it. And then from inside the ambulance, not a shout, not a scream, something worse than either of those things. "She's coding. I need help now." The world went still. Not quiet, there was still music playing, still 18,000 people watching a live stream, still the mechanical clicking of the emergency lights. But something in Rafe McCallum's perception went absolutely still. He looked at the ambulance, at the window, at the silhouette behind the glass moving with the compressed, urgent, repetitive motion of someone doing chest compressions on a person who had stopped. He looked at his hands, these hands. Scarred at the knuckles, broken once at the index and ring fingers, on the right crooked where they'd healed without being properly set. Hands that had rebuilt engines from the ground up. Hands that had held his mother's hand at his father's funeral when he was 11 years old and needed something solid to hold on to. He felt the rage moving through him like something with mass and temperature. He recognized it. He had felt it before, this exact flavor of it, this specific heat. At 15, watching his father take a pool cue to a man in a bar parking lot. At 23, pulling a brother off a situation that had gone wrong in a way that could only be interrupted, never undone. Both times he'd felt it, things had ended badly. He closed the distance. His right hand came up. The specific muscle memory of something he'd spent 35 years trying to unlearn, activated without his permission, and he was 3 steps away, and the fist was at shoulder height, and there was nothing in his vision except Mason Garrett's face. "Wait." The word came from Mason, not performed, not broadcast, something from a register below all the performance, from the part of a person that exists before they learn to have an audience. "Wait, okay." His voice had changed entirely. The camera was still recording. He didn't look at it. "I'll move. I'll help. I know these streets. I can get her there in 10 minutes. Let me drive, please." Rafe's fist was 3 inches from Mason Garrett's face. He held it there. The two of them stood in the boiling Arizona afternoon, close enough that Rafe could see the kid's eyes clearly, and what he saw there stopped his hand more completely than any threat could have. He had seen those eyes before. Not on Mason Garrett, on himself. On the face in the bathroom mirror at 2 in the morning when he was 24 years old and lost and angry and so desperately certain that the anger was the only real thing left in him. Rafe lowered his fist. Not slowly, not dramatically. He lowered it the way you put down something heavy because you've decided you're done carrying it. Your car. Not a question. The M5. I know the Camelback route. I know where the Guas are and the lights. 10 minutes, I swear to God. Cole appeared at Rafe's shoulder. Press. Your call. Rafe looked at Mason Garrett for 3 more seconds. Whatever he was reading there, it was sufficient. You screw this up, Rafe said. You understand what that means. I won't. I swear I won't. It happened in 90 seconds. The back doors of the ambulance flew open and Kathleen came out, wild-eyed hair, escaping its braid, one hand on her radio, the other already reaching for the backboard. She didn't look at Rafe. She took in the situation in a single scan and began directing. Rafe saw his mother for the first time. Nora McCallum, 83 years old. The woman who had pressed a pocket watch into his 17-year-old hands and told him every mile matters. Gray as ash, mouth slack, eyes closed. Somewhere underneath all the technology attached to her, the leads, the IV, lined the oxygen mask was the woman who sang old songs from a country she'd never been to while she tended her roses in the early morning before the heat arrived. Ma! His voice came out on a different frequency than his normal voice. Something stripped down. I'm here. No response. They loaded her into the M5's back seat with a speed that looked like chaos from the outside and was precision from the inside. Kathleen folded herself in beside Nora, never stopping compressions. Her partner took the passenger seat. Mason was already behind the wheel. He met Rafe's eyes through the windshield. 1 beat. 2. The engine came alive, all 503 horsepower of it, obscene and beautiful and exactly what they needed. Rafe swung onto his Road King, keyed his radio. All brothers, Formation Alpha, we're running code. Stay tight. Nobody stops us. Nobody. 20 engines answered with thunder. The cars scattered. Officer Kerr put her cruiser lights on and pulled ahead without being asked. The corridor opened. The convoy moved. And Rafe McCallum rode point through the streets of Phoenix with his mother in the car behind him, and everything he had ever built compressed down to the dimensions of the next 10 minutes. He rode with both hands on the bars and his eyes straight ahead. He did not pray. He had not prayed in a long time. But something moved through him as the city blurred past something that was not quite language and not quite feeling, that shaped itself without his permission into a single specific direction. Hold on, Ma. Just hold on. The emergency entrance of Desert Springs Medical Center appeared at the end of the block. Trauma team visible at the doors, mobilized, waiting, already moving as the convoy screamed into the access lane. The BMW stopped. Doors opened. Kathleen was out before the car had fully stopped, still working, calling out numbers to the team. They wheeled Nora inside. The automatic doors opened. Then the automatic doors closed. And Rafe McCallum stood in the parking lot with his helmet in his hand and watched the space where his mother had been until it was just a set of doors, and the doors were just metal and the glass reflected back only the Arizona sky and himself standing in it. Cole parked beside him, said nothing. The brothers arrived in formation, parked, turned off their engines one by one until the lot was quiet. Rafe did not move. He stood there in the heat, the pocket watch warm against his chest, and he waited. Every mile matters. He was beginning to understand what that meant in ways that 17-year-old version of himself, standing in a kitchen that smelled like rosewater and dish soap, had not yet been equipped to understand. The waiting room at Desert Springs Medical Center smelled like industrial cleaner and recycled air, and the particular species of anxiety that accumulates in a room where people spend hours sitting with things they cannot control. 12 brothers filled it. They did not fidget. They did not make noise. They sat the way men sit when they understand that what is required of them right now is simply to remain, not to fix, not to intervene, not to apply force to the problem in the way they were built and practiced to do, but simply to be present in the same space as someone who is carrying something heavy. Cole sat directly to Rafe's left and had not moved from that position in 40 minutes, which was Cole Drummond in miniature, present, aligned, requiring nothing. Mason Garrett stood near the far door. He had not sat down. He stood with his back partially to the room, his weight shifting occasionally from one foot to the other, his phone in his hand, but the screen dark. The live stream had ended somewhere on the drive over. The 18,000 people had dispersed into the algorithm's next offering. What remained was a 24-year-old standing in a hospital waiting room he hadn't anticipated being in, uncertain whether he was allowed to occupy the space. Rafe was aware of him. He didn't look at him directly, but he noticed the details. The quality of Mason's stillness. The way he'd driven, not reckless, not performing, but with a precision that told you the skill was real underneath all the theater. He'd taken the camelback route exactly as he'd said, threading through the signal timing gaps with the certainty of someone who had mapped these streets at speed until the knowledge became physical. The BMW had moved like something alive. He'd held the turns without overcorrecting. He'd braked hard when he needed to and not before. The kid could drive. At some point in the second hour, Rafe stood and crossed the room. He stopped in front of Mason. Didn't say anything at first. Just looked at him the way he looked at an engine that was telling him something he hadn't identified yet. "Why did you stop?" Rafe said. "On Cedar Hill. You had the audience, you had the law on your side. Why?" Mason was quiet for long enough that Rafe thought he wasn't going to answer. 3 years ago. Mason's voice came from somewhere low and carefully controlled. "My brother Ryan, 22 years old. He was in a car accident on a Wednesday afternoon, nothing serious, the other driver said, a fender thing. But Ryan hit his head and something wasn't right. They called an ambulance." He stopped. "The ambulance got stuck. Street racing event 6 blocks from where Ryan was sitting on the curb waiting. 47 minutes. By the time they reached him, the bleed in his brain had been going too long." Rafe said nothing. "I wasn't there. I was across the city when my mom called. I drove as fast as I could and I got there after." Mason looked at the floor. "I've thought about those 47 minutes every day since. About whoever was blocking that road. About how it would have taken 5 seconds. One person deciding to move." He finally looked up. "When I saw the ambulance on Cedar Hill, I knew what was in it. Not specifically, but I knew, and I kept thinking, I'm the person. I'm the one from that day. I'm standing on the wrong side of this." Rafe held his gaze for a moment, then he went back to his chair and sat down. Cole looked at him once. Rafe gave him nothing back except the slight forward lean that meant, "I'll explain later." The waiting room clock continued its work. At 1 hour and 14 minutes, the surgery doors opened. Dr. Helena Vance walked through them. Mid-50s surgical cap, removed gray hair, pulled back in a way that suggested function rather than presentation. She had the face of someone who had delivered news in both directions enough times to understand that her job was to be clear, not kind, though she had learned over the years that clarity delivered with care was its own form of mercy. The room stood, not because anyone directed them to. All 12 brothers rose, and Cole rose beside Rafe, and even Mason Garrett at the far door straightened from the wall. The movement was collective and unrehearsed, like a congregation responding to something larger than any individual signal. Dr. Vance looked at Rafe. "Mr. McCallum, your mother's surgery was successful. We removed the clot. She's stable." The relief hit somewhere below the ribs. Cole exhaled beside him, a slow, careful exhalation. The kind you release when you've been holding it long enough that releasing it is a decision. Someone behind them said something that wasn't a word. Mason Garrett put one hand flat against the wall and leaned into it briefly. Forehead dropped toward his chest. Rafe unclenched his hands. "Can I see her, Tom?" "In a few hours. She's in recovery." Dr. Vance held his gaze. "Mr. McCallum, there's something else we need to discuss. Somewhere private." The relief curdled, not dramatically, but the word private in the context of a doctor who had just used it carries a specific gravity that every adult in a hospital waiting room understands immediately. They went to a consultation room 3 doors down the corridor. Small and windowless, with chairs in a configuration designed for conversations nobody wanted to have. A framed print on the wall of a canyon chosen by someone who understood that people in this room needed something to look at other than each other. Rafe remained standing. "Just tell me." Dr. Vance set the tablet on the table, pulled up charts. "When we ran your mother's pre-surgical blood work, we found markers. Elevated CA 19.9. Abnormal liver function panels. Several other indicators that prompted us to run additional tests while she was under." She looked at him directly. "Your mother has pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. It has metastasized to her liver and we believe to her lungs as well." The room was the same size it had been 30 seconds ago. Rafe stood in it and understood that it was the same room and he was the same man, and none of the dimensions had changed in any measurable way, and yet something structural had shifted the way a load-bearing wall shifts before a house settles. Not catastrophically, but in a way that changes the geometry of everything around it. How long has she known? Based on the progression, I'm seeing 18 months. Possibly longer. 18 months. Rafe sat down. He had not intended to sit. He sat because his legs had registered information his mind was still processing. 18 months, every Sunday phone call. Every conversation about the roses, about the neighbor's dog, about whether he'd been eating properly. Every time she'd asked about the club and listened to his answers with that particular attentiveness, not just hearing the words, but hearing the person delivering them. 18 months and she hadn't said a word. Treatment options. At this stage with her age and now, the stroke chemotherapy would be difficult on her system. It could buy time. 3 months, perhaps 6 if she responds well. A pause. Without treatment, we're looking at weeks. Weeks. Cole put a hand on the table. Not on Rafe's arm, on the table 3 inches to Rafe's left. Present without being presumptuous. There's one more thing. Dr. Vance removed an envelope from the folder she was carrying. The nurse found this in your mother's personal effects. It's addressed to you. She left specific instructions if anything happened to her, this was to be given to you immediately. She placed it on the table. Standard white envelope, blue ink, the handwriting Rafe had known since before he could read that precise, careful cursive that had appeared on birthday cards and grocery lists, and the notes she used to pack in his lunchbox when he was small. Notes that said things like, work hard today and be kind when you can, and I love you. Signed always with just her initial N because she believes signatures should be economical. Just his name on the front, Rafe. Dr. Vance left them. He sat with the envelope for a moment, not avoiding it, just acknowledging its weight before he added it to what he was already carrying. He opened it, 2 pages of Nora's handwriting, the Catholic school cursive she'd learned in Galway in 1952, which had survived emigration and decades of American influence, and come out the other side still recognizably itself like she had. She opened by telling him she was sorry she hadn't told him about the cancer. Not because she'd been afraid she knew him better than that, but because she knew exactly what he would have done. He would have stopped living his own life to stand watch over the ending of hers. She had decided she didn't want her last months to be a vigil. She wanted them to be Sundays. Then she shifted. She told him she'd been keeping track, not recently, for 30 years. Every accident, every hospital visit, the 7 concussions she knew about and the others she suspected he hadn't reported. She'd kept a notebook, a small blue spiral notebook, stored in the drawer of her bedside table. She'd been updating it since 1994. She told him about the things she'd noticed, the way he'd started telling the same stories twice in a single conversation without knowing he'd already told them, the headaches that came every few weeks, the ones he thought he'd hidden from her. She had always known, even over the phone, even when he said he was fine, there was a quality to his voice that she had cataloged over 5 decades and could read as precisely as a gauge. And she told him about Frank. She told him that Frank McCallum had not been simply a violent man. She told him about 1978, about dragging Frank to a doctor only once, because Frank McCallum didn't do doctors and wouldn't go back. About the brain scans, about the terminology the doctor had used, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, irreversible cognitive decline. About the way the doctor had described Frank's brain after 30 years of amateur boxing, 200 matches before he was 25, every one of them leaving its mark. She told him the doctor said the damage was not the man. She had spent 47 years not knowing how to say that to her son. Not because she doubted it, because she was afraid that if she told him Frank's violence had a neurological cause, it might give Rafe permission to excuse it. She had not wanted him to excuse it. She had only wanted him to understand it. And now, because she was 83 years old and the pancreatic cancer had been speaking to her for 18 months in a language she'd learned to translate, she was telling him all of it. She told him she'd arranged for a nurse, Sylvie Hartwell, who was coming to help care for Nora at home, to also keep an eye on Rafe. Not to monitor him, just to be present, to be the kind of steady professional presence that might notice things Rafe wouldn't report himself. She'd made this arrangement 6 months ago. She hadn't told him because she'd known he wouldn't accept help if he knew it was coming. So she'd arranged it to arrive before he knew he needed it. Get tested, she wrote. Not for me, for yourself. For the years you still have. There's money set aside. Desert Federal. Use it. And then in her final paragraph, one sentence that sat on the page differently from everything around it. Your father wasn't the man the damage made him. He was the man who held you when you were 3 hours old and wept. Wept Rafe in a way I had never seen him weep before or since, because he said he had never in his life made anything worth protecting. Rafe put the letter on the table. He did not pick it up again for a long time. Cole read it when Rafe passed it to him. He read it slowly. When he finished, he set it down with the same care you'd use for something fragile, though the paper was not fragile. The care was for something else. How long have you known? Cole asked. The headaches, the gaps. Rafe didn't answer immediately. Long enough that I should have said something. Cole's jaw moved. I've seen it. Last 3-4 years. You'd lose a word, lose a thread, come back to it 10 minutes later like nothing happened. I told myself it was stress, age. He paused. I told myself those things because they were easier than the other thing. I'm getting tested. Cole nodded, said nothing else. There was nothing else to say. They sat in that room until the nurse came to tell them Nora was awake. She was smaller in the bed than Rafe had been prepared for. He had known intellectually that she was 83 years old and had just survived major surgery. But knowing it and seeing it, the machines around her, the IV line, the way the hospital gown made everyone who wore it look like they were borrowing someone else's life, were two different experiences. He looked at her eyes first. They were clear. That was the first thing he always checked, not as a medical assessment, but as a son's instinct. She was there. Hey, Ma. My boy. Rough voice, the breathing tube's aftermath. But the tenor underneath was the same. 60 years of the same voice. He sat in the chair beside her bed and took her hand. You read it, she said. I read it. She studied his face the way she always had, reading backward from the expression to the interior state, with the expertise of someone who had been translating him since he was 3 hours old. Mad at me? Never, he meant it. But 18 months, Ma. I know. You could have. I know what I could have done. Not unkindly, but firmly. And you know what you would have done. We've been each other long enough to skip the middle part, Rafe. She was right. They both knew it. The cancer, he said. I've made my peace. God and I have some things to settle, but we've been negotiating for years. I think we'll work it out. The ghost of a smile. Then quieter. What scared me was you, not what the cancer would do to me, what you might become if I didn't say it in time. He held her hand and looked at the window, which showed him only the parking structure and a square of Arizona sky going orange at the edges. I'll get tested. Promise me. I promise. She relaxed against the pillow, a specific, almost visible release, the way a person releases tension when they have completed something they were holding themselves together to complete. He sat beside her until she slept. The cognitive assessment happened the following afternoon. Dr. Owen Marsh was 40 years old, methodical, with the temperament of someone who had learned to deliver difficult information in a way that gave people space to process it. Count backward from 100 by sevens. Rafe got to 72. Stopped. The next number was there, and then it wasn't like reaching for something on a shelf and finding the shelf empty in a way that makes you question whether you put it there in the first place. He said 72 again, aware he was repeating himself, unable to prevent it. Remember these 3 words. Apple, compass, lantern, 5 minutes of other tasks. Then the 3 words, apple, caramel, lantern. He sat very still. Compass arrived 11 seconds late, as if someone had to go find it from a significant distance. Draw a clock showing 3:15. He drew the circle, drew the numbers, placed them correctly, verified each one against his internal map of what a clock face looked like. Drew the hands, looked at what his hand had produced. The hands were wrong. He knew they were wrong. He could see the discrepancy between what he'd intended and what the pen had made, and he could not explain the gap between those two things because the gap should not have existed. He set down the pen. 40 minutes of tests, 40 minutes of failing at things that should have been automatic. The MRI happened the next morning. 45 minutes in a machine that was clinical and absolute and not designed to accommodate the psychology of men who spent their lives in open air. Rafe closed his eyes and thought about carburetors, about the specific problem of a needle valve stuck at the wrong position, and what it did to fuel mixture, and what fuel mixture did to combustion, and what combustion did to everything downstream. He used technical precision as meditation because it was the only kind he knew. When they pulled him out, he looked at the technician. The technician's face said everything Dr. Marsh would say more formally 2 hours later. CTE, stage 2 progressing toward 3. The tau protein buildup causing inflammation and cell death in regions that controlled impulse regulation, memory formation, and emotional processing, which meant the rage that came on fast and hot, the gaps, the stories told twice. Not purely him, something inside him working from a damaged blueprint, making decisions with architecture, compromised over decades of impact, not the man he'd intended to be, but the man he'd become in the hours when his guard was down. Just like Frank. If I keep doing what I'm doing, Rafe said to Dr. Marsh, how long before I'm like my father? Marsh did not look away. Based on the progression, I'm seeing 5 years, possibly less. And if I stop, significant lifestyle modifications, no more head trauma, no high-risk riding, manage your stress, regular monitoring. A pause. You could have 15, 20 years of meaningful cognitive function. You won't die from this, Mr. McCallum. You'll die with it. But the difference between those two things is entirely in your hands. Rafe nodded. He looked at the window. Outside in the Desert Springs parking lot, his Road King was parked in a row with 11 other bikes, brothers who had come back this morning without being asked, who were sitting in the waiting room or standing in the parking lot doing what the brotherhood actually meant in its daily practice. Not the dramatic moments, but this showing up and staying. 5 years if he kept going. His father had been 43. He was 58. He had already outlived Frank McCallum by 15 years, and he had a choice Frank had never been offered because the knowledge hadn't existed, and because nobody had loved Frank carefully enough to gather it and put it in his hands in time. He had a choice. He stood up. On the 8th day after Nora had come home, the brothers made it happen in less than 48 hours, coordinating Brendan and 2 other prospects doing the physical work, the medical equipment in place before Nora was discharged. Hospital bed oxygen concentrator, medication organizer, safety rails for the bathroom. Sylvie Hartwell was there when they arrived, practical and calm, and had taken one look at Nora's bedroom window and the rose garden visible through it and made 2 small adjustments to the bed's position. She did it without comment, just looked at the room, understood what it contained, and arranged it accordingly. That evening, when Nora was settled and the house had reached the quiet that follows a large thing being accomplished, Rafe retrieved the box from his mother's closet. Oak worn smooth at the corners, behind the winter coats that hadn't been worn since a December cold snap years ago. He knew it the way children know the fixed coordinates of their world, not examined, just known. He carried it to Nora's bedroom. She was awake. He opened the box. The brass urn had been there as long as he had a memory to put it in. Frank McCallum. A name and 2 dates, and between them, the sum of a life that had ended in a jail cell in 1979 at the age of 43. Below the urn, an envelope, yellowed at the edges. His name on the front, in Frank's block letters, the handwriting of a man who'd left school at 14, whose letters were always slightly too large for the lines they were written on. He wrote it 3 days before he died, Nora said. Gave it to me at the jail. Made me promise. Rafe looked at the envelope. He said, don't give it to him until he's old enough to understand. Her voice was quiet with the heaviness of a decision reconsidered over 4 decades. I was afraid you'd see him broken and lose what little good you still had of him, but I think I waited too long. He opened the envelope. Notebook paper, spiral-bound edge, the perforations still attached. Block letters, the handwriting of a man who'd never had a writing teacher patient enough to correct his sizing. Frank had known. That was the thing that landed differently than anything Rafe had anticipated. He had constructed a version of his father over 47 years out of fragments, out of what he remembered and what others had told him and what the shape of the absence suggested. The version he'd built was simpler than the man in this letter. The man in this letter had understood on clear days that the doing of damage was not separable from him, even if the source of it was. Had tried to stop and discovered that trying and stopping were different things when your brain had been turned into a landscape of its own wreckage. Had lived in a private hell that made the external facts of his behavior look almost bearable by comparison. The last lines, I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to know it wasn't hate. It was damage. There's a difference. Make sure your story ends different from mine. Rafe folded the letter. He held it in both hands for a moment, feeling the weight of 47 years of a question that had just received its answer. He knew, Rafe said. He knew. Nora reached out and put her hand on his. And now you know. The difference is you still have time. He stayed with her until she slept. He drove home through the late Phoenix evening, sat at his kitchen table, then called Cole. I need a full chapter meeting. My place, tomorrow night. Everyone who holds a patch. Cole didn't ask questions. Done. Rafe set the phone down. He thought about Frank McCallum, about a man who had known what was happening to him and could not stop it. About what that was like to live inside a deterioration you could see clearly on good days and couldn't access at all on the bad ones. He thought about the tests, about the word compass arriving 11 seconds late, about the clock face he couldn't draw correctly. His story could still end different, if he chose it. 14 brothers filled Rafe's living room the following night. They came without being told why. They sat in the living room of a man they'd ridden with across 3 states and through situations that had no polite names, and they waited. Rafe stood in front of them. He did not manage the information. I'm sick. Same thing that killed my father. CTE brain damage from the accidents and the fights over 30 years. It's not going to improve. It's going to get worse. The doctor says 5 years if I keep doing what I'm doing, 20 if I make changes. The room held a silence that had texture. What kind of changes? Hammer, the sergeant-at-arms. The man had taken a round for Rafe in 2008. No more fighting, no more high-risk riding, no more being the guy who leads the charge. Rafe met each of their eyes in turn. That means stepping down as president. Nobody spoke. Cole stood. Then I'm stepping up. If the chapter votes it. 30 seconds. Unanimous. Cole Drummond became president. Rafe sat down in what had been his chair. In 10 minutes, it would be Cole's chair. You stay in, Cole said. Retired elder. We need your head even if we don't need your hands. Rafe nodded. Someone in the back said your mother. What does she need? And then they went around the room and the logistics of Nora's care assembled themselves without direction. Who would handle what? Who had what capacity? How to rotate? So Rafe was not doing it alone. 11 minutes at the end of it, nothing had been left unaddressed. That was the thing. Not the patch or the reputation or the mythology. That was the actual substance of what 30 years had built. Nora McCallum came home on a Thursday, not to a facility, not to some managed care environment with beige walls and the industrial smell of cleaning products working to cover something they could never fully cover. She came home to the house on Estrella Drive, where she had lived for 51 years, where the kitchen still had the same cast iron hooks her husband had installed in 1974, where the floorboards in the hallway creaked in the specific sequence that Rafe had memorized as a child, and that still operated as a kind of time machine every time he walked through the front door. Sylvie Hartwell was there before Nora arrived. She took one look at the bedroom window and the rose garden visible through it and made 2 small adjustments to the bed's position that put the garden directly in Nora's sightline. She did it without comment, just looked at the room, understood what it contained, and arranged it. Nora noticed, didn't say anything. But Rafe saw her look at the window from the bed and something in her face settled. Mason Garrett arrived at 7 in the morning with paint. Pale yellow already mixed the color Nora had described over the phone as early morning sun, which was both a color and a memory, and a request compressed into 3 words. He had 2 rollers and a tray, and he did not ask what needed doing. He looked at the walls, and he started. By 10 o'clock, the bedroom was transformed, the yellow doing exactly what that color does in a room, with good natural light, making the space feel like something beginning rather than ending. He also transplanted one of the rose bushes from the garden into a ceramic pot and positioned it on the windowsill so that when the window was open, which in the Arizona September, it could be in the mornings, the smell came in with the air. Nora saw it when they brought her in. She looked at the pot, at the rose, at Mason, who was cleaning his roller at the far end of the room and who had not positioned himself to receive acknowledgement. She said that was thoughtful. 2 words. From Nora McCallum, that was a significant review. The first week settled into a rhythm the way all difficult things eventually do not, because the difficulty resolves, but because human beings are built for adaptation. Mornings were the good hours. Nora woke with something approaching clarity, wanting conversation, issuing opinions on matters that ranged from the political to the botanical to the theological, with the same even authority she'd always had. She wanted to hear about the shop. Every day she asked about Second Wind, the name he hadn't settled yet, the space on the east side, Mason's progress, whether Brendan had finished the carburetor rebuild. Rafe told her all of it with detail, with the texture of the actual thing, not a summary of it. She listened the way she had always listened, fully, reading underneath the words for what wasn't being said. Sylvie came every morning at 8. She was 45 years old, 5 years a widow. Her husband gone to the same disease that was now working its way through Nora, and she carried the kind of knowledge that loss teaches in a way that nothing else does. Not knowledge about death, knowledge about the space around it, about what to say and what to leave alone. She and Rafe developed a language around Nora's care that had very little actual vocabulary. Nods, the position of a chair, whether the window was open or closed when he arrived. A particular look that meant today is harder, carrying more information than most sentences could. He found himself looking for reasons to be at the house in the hours Sylvie was there. He noticed this and did not examine it. He filed it under things to think about later when there was a later with enough room in it. On the afternoon of the eighth day, Nora asked Rafe to get the box. He brought it from the closet, the oak box worn smooth. Inside Frank's urn, the yellowed envelope he'd already read. He set it on the tray beside the bed. Nora looked at it with the expression of someone seeing something they have looked at 10,000 times and are still not done with. I talk to him every night, she said. People would have thought I was a crazy old woman, talking to ashes in a jar. She looked at Rafe. Maybe I was, but it kept me honest. Hard to be dishonest when you're talking to someone who knew you better than you knew yourself. I need you to promise me something. Tell me first, the ghost of a smile. Smart boy. Still, she put her hand on the box. When I go mix mine with his. Bury us together under the big rose bush, the one by the trellis. Frank built that trellis. She paused. He built it because I mentioned once, just once, that I'd always wanted one. Came home 2 Saturdays later with lumber and hardware and built the thing all afternoon while you toddled around in the dirt getting in his way. She looked at the window, at the trellis visible through the glass. That's the man he was, underneath everything the damage made him. I'll do it, I promise. She nodded with the satisfaction of someone who has properly handed off what they were responsible for. Then she said, there's something else you need to know. And she told him about Sylvie. Not what he thought she was going to tell him. Something operational, something Nora McCallum had arranged. She had contacted Sylvie Hartwell 7 months before the stroke. Not as a hospice referral, as a request. She'd found her through a friend in the medical community, spoken with her on the phone for 40 minutes, and explained the situation with a frankness Sylvie had told her she'd never encountered from a patient's family before. She'd said, my son is showing signs of something he won't admit and won't seek help for. I need someone with medical training who can be present in his life without him knowing that's what they're doing. I need someone with the character to hold that responsibility correctly. She had arranged for Sylvie to be Rafe's quiet safety net before either of them knew a safety net would be needed. And then she had made the introduction possible by creating the circumstances under which Rafe would meet her, by arranging her own end-of-life care in a way that put exactly the right person in exactly the right proximity at exactly the right time. Rafe sat with this. You planned all of it. I planned what I could. Her voice was matter-of-fact. I've been a mother for 58 years, Rafe. Planning around your stubbornness is not a new skill. He looked at the window, at the rose bush in the ceramic pot, at the trellis beyond it. Does she know that you told me? She knows I intended to. A pause. She's a good woman. She understands complicated things. She won't make it strange unless you do. Another pause shorter. Don't make it strange. Yes, ma'am. She settled back against the pillow, the particular release of someone who has completed what they were holding themselves together to complete. She had been planning quietly for the futures of people who didn't know they were being planned for, arranging the conditions under which they might become more fully themselves. That was Nora McCallum. That had always been Nora McCallum. He had thought of her for most of his life as the person who held things together. The constant, the fixed point. He had not fully seen until these past 10 days that holding things together required an ongoing, deliberate, exhausting act of construction. She had not simply been steady. She had been steadily building every day with whatever materials were available, and she had never once let the scarcity of materials become an excuse for stopping work. He stayed until 9 o'clock, drove home through the Phoenix dark. On day 16, Nora asked to see Mason. Rafe called him that morning. Mason arrived in the early evening. He'd been at the shop since 7, which Rafe knew because he'd been there until noon himself. Mason arrived with clean clothes and a single red rose he'd found growing through the chain-link fence of an empty lot 2 blocks away, the kind of volunteer rose that shows up in desert lots without explanation and grows with the stubbornness of things that have decided to exist in conditions not designed for them. Nora's face when she saw it. She took it and held it and looked at Mason with the expression Rafe recognized as the one she reserved for people she was about to take seriously. Come sit down, she said. I can't turn my head that far. Mason sat in the chair at the bedside with the posture of someone uncertain of their right to occupy a space but present in it anyway. Nora studied him. You remind me of Rafe, she said, when he was your age. Mason glanced at Rafe in the corner. He was angry the same way you're angry. The anger that comes from something you did that you can't undo. He'd made decisions and people he cared about had paid for them. He spent about 4 years being furious about that. The fury was easier than the guilt. Fury points outward. Guilt points inward, and inward is a harder direction to sustain. Mason was very still. The fury runs out eventually, Nora continued. One way or another, either you find something real to put in its place or it finishes the job you started. She reached out her hand. He took it without hesitation. You found something real. I'm trying to. Trying is the beginning of doing. She patted his hand, released it. Now, I want to hear about your brother. So Mason told her about Ryan, not how he died, who he'd been, about the fact that Ryan was the one who could fix anything mechanical, who'd taught himself from library books, and by taking apart every appliance in the house until their mother banned him from touching anything with a power cord. About Ryan's laugh too loud for indoor spaces and completely genuine, the kind that made strangers turn around. About the last conversation Mason had with him, which had been unremarkable, logistical, the kind of brief exchange between brothers that carries no weight because there's no reason to think it needs to. Nora listened. She didn't offer comfort. She didn't redirect towards silver linings. She just received the information about who Ryan Garrett had been, with the full attention of someone for whom listening was its own form of gift. When Mason finished, she said, he sounds like someone worth grieving properly. Mason nodded. Couldn't speak. Properly, Nora said. Not forever. There's a difference. After Mason left, Rafe came to the bedside. Nora was quiet for a while. Then that boy needs to tell his mother. Rafe looked at her. About what he did, about his part in Ryan's death. He's carrying it alone, and it'll kill him slower than anything else. She turned to look at him. You can't help him with that part, but you can make sure he understands it needs doing. The way I had to make sure you understood certain things needed doing. You arranged a lot of things, Ma. Someone had to. Simply factual. You're all so busy being capable. Nobody asks for help. Nobody admits what they don't know. You just keep driving until you run out of road. She closed her eyes. I've been watching men do that my entire life. Your father, the men at the club, you. It is an exhausting thing to watch. He didn't argue, because she was right. He stayed until she slept. 3 weeks later, on a Friday evening, after the rest of the crew had gone home, Mason found Rafe at the workbench, going through invoices. The shop was quiet in the way that got it after hours, the hydraulic lifts at rest, the overhead lights at half the smell of motor oil and metal that had become, in a few months, its own specific kind of familiar. Mason stood in the bay entrance for a moment. Then he walked in and sat on an overturned crate across from Rafe. I need to tell you something, he said. Something I didn't finish telling you in the waiting room. Rafe set down the invoices. I told you Ryan was stuck in an ambulance blocked by street racers. Mason's voice had the flatness of something rehearsed and still not ready. What I didn't tell you, what I haven't told anyone, is that I organized that run. That day, I set it up. He stopped, started again. And when my mom called, I was still at the scene. I saw her name on the phone and I put it in my pocket and I got in my car and I drove away before the police arrived. The shop held its particular after-hours silence. I was at a bar 4 miles away when they told me he was gone. He set his hands flat on the workbench, looked at them. I've told myself for 3 years that I didn't know how bad it was, that I thought it was minor, that I would have stayed if I'd known. He looked up. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if I would have stayed. 3 years, Rafe said. 3 years. I turned it into content. I told myself I was honoring him. He loved cars, he loved speed, and I just made his death into the reason I got to keep doing the thing that got him killed. His jaw moved. On Cedar Hill, I was drunk. I started drinking at noon because it was Ryan's anniversary. I wanted someone to stop me. And I almost made you. But you didn't, Rafe said. Mason looked at him. You stopped before I had to. That matters. I don't think it's enough. I didn't say it was enough. I said it matters. Rafe leaned back from the workbench. My father killed a man in a bar fight when I was 11 years old. He died in a jail cell 6 weeks later. I spent 47 years trying to be something different. And 2 days ago on Cedar Hill Boulevard, I had my fist 6 inches from your face. The fluorescent lights hummed at half their daytime frequency. I've been running from a ghost my whole life. Turns out the ghost wasn't what I thought. Turns out my father knew what was happening to him and couldn't stop it. And I have the same thing starting in me. And I have a choice he never had. He looked at Mason. You have a choice Ryan didn't have. He'd be 25 now. I know. A long silence. The kind that fills with the things that don't need to be said because they're already understood. You need to tell your mother, Rafe said. Not me, not a camera, your mother. She lost Ryan. She's still got you. She deserves to know who she still has the actual version, not the one you've been performing. Mason put his face in his hands, stayed like that for a moment, not crying exactly. Something harder and quieter, the internal reckoning of someone who has been maintaining a position for a long time and has finally stopped having the energy to hold it. Then he straightened. Does it get easier, he asked, living with what you've done? Rafe thought about the question seriously. He owed it that. No, he said, but you get better at carrying it. And that's not the same as easier, but it's the thing that's actually available. He stood from the stool. The other thing that helps is putting something real in its place. Something that isn't about managing the guilt. Something that's actually worth the hours. He walked to the door, turned. Second win, Monday morning, 7 a.m. every Monday. Mason nodded. It was the thing that could be offered. It was accepted. At 3:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in late September, Nora McCallum took her last breath. Rafe had been sitting beside the bed since midnight. Not because Sylvie had told him it was time, though she had suggested gently that he might want to be close, but because the quality of the house's silence had been telling him something was shifting and he did not want to be somewhere else when it completed its shift. Cole was in the living room. Brendan Shea was on the porch, which he'd claimed at 10 o'clock and maintained with the faithfulness of a young man who has not yet learned that the hardest vigils don't require physical proximity, only presence. Rafe was holding Nora's hand. He had been talking to her quietly for the past hour, not asking her to stay, just telling her things about the shop, about the sign he'd decided on, about the rosebush in the ceramic pot that had put out a new bud 2 days ago, and that he intended to plant back in the garden in the spring. He told her that Mason had called his mother, that the call had lasted 3 hours, that Mason had shown up for work the next morning looking like something had been set down that he'd been carrying for a long time. He told her the name of the shop, Second Wind Custom Motorcycles. She didn't respond. She hadn't responded in 24 hours, not in any way that language could hold. But he believed with the certainty of someone who has known a person for 58 years that some part of what he was saying reached her the way signals sometimes find the receiver they were meant for, even through interference. At 3:47, she breathed in. The exhale that should have followed did not come. He sat very still. The room was the same room. The machines continued their functions. The rosebush on the windowsill was a shadow in the darkness. The trellis beyond the glass, which Frank McCallum had built on a Saturday in 1971 because his wife mentioned wanting one, was visible against the faint ambient light of a city that never went entirely dark. Rafe held her hand and felt the warmth begin very slowly to change. Okay, Ma, he said. Just that. Cole appeared in the doorway. He had heard the change in the monitor's tone without being told what it meant. He stood there and looked at Rafe and at the woman in the bed who had been more of a mother to him than the one he'd been born to, and he stayed in the doorway because the room belonged to the two of them, and some things required that kind of witness. Rafe reached into his vest pocket, the pocket watch, 3:47. He held it in his hand for a moment, feeling its weight, the familiar worn smoothness of the case, the small dent from 2003. Then he set it on the adjustable tray beside the bed. He would pick it up again. He knew that. But in this moment, he wanted it to be beside her for the same reason she had given it to him in the first place, as a marker, a point of contact between where something started and where it had arrived. He stayed until the hospice came, until the necessary things were done, until the house on Estrella Drive, the fixed coordinate of his world for 58 years, was still and very quiet in the particular way that places are quiet after something that has been their center has departed. Brendan Shea drove him home at sunrise. Didn't say anything. Just drove the way the kid had learned that presence was the offering and words were beside the point. 214 people came to the funeral. They came from 3 states. Brothers from chapters Rafe had never met in person. Veterans she'd sat with at the VA hospital in the 90s when she'd volunteered on Tuesday afternoons for 11 years. Neighbors who'd lived on Estrella Drive for decades. A woman who had been Nora's nursing colleague in 1978 and who had driven in from Tucson at the age of 81 because she said Nora McCallum was the person who had taught her that competent care and human kindness were not competing values. Officer Dana Kerr arrived in dress uniform. Off duty, she stood near the back and caught Rafe's eye once with a nod that carried in its few seconds the complete acknowledgement of everything that had happened on Cedar Hill Boulevard and everything that had followed, compressed into a gesture that required no elaboration. Sylvie Hartwell stood beside the rose trellis and did not try to occupy more space than was hers to occupy, which was in itself one of the things. Mason Garrett was there in an ill-fitting suit, standing at the edge of the gathering with the posture of someone uncertain of his right to grieve in a given space. He stood there the whole time. He was still there at the end. Rafe delivered the eulogy standing beside the largest rosebush in the garden, the one Nora had planted the year he was born. He had written some of it, abandoned the written version the night before. What he said instead was the thing that existed before language had been applied to it, the facts of who she had been, not the curated version, the actual one. He said she was tougher than any man he'd ever known. He said she had loved his father through what the disease made him become, not by excusing it, but by refusing to let the disease be the final word on who Frank McCallum was. He said she had understood long before the rest of them that holding people to the fullness of who they were, rather than the worst of what they'd done, was not softness, but the most demanding form of precision. He said she had been planning for them, all of them, while she was dying. That she had used what was left of her strength, not for her own comfort, but for the architecture of what she was leaving behind. That she had looked at every person she loved and identified what they needed and arranged for it to be available quietly, without announcement, the way she had always done everything that mattered. He said, she taught me that strength is not measured by how rarely you fall. It is measured by how consistently you choose to rise. He said, she taught me that legacy is not what you leave when you die. It is what you build while you are living. He did not lose his composure in the way that people sometimes expect public grief to manifest. He was a 58-year-old man with a damaged brain and 35 years of learning to keep the interior and the exterior in a workable relationship. And he stood by his mother's rosebush in the September Arizona morning and said what was true. At the end, he crouched down. He set the brass urn Frank's and now Nora's mixed together as she'd asked into the ground beneath the bush. He had prepared the spot 2 days earlier with his own hands, with a trowel from the tool shed that still had dirt from the last time she'd used it caked into the grooves of the handle. He pressed the soil down with both palms. The fiddles started then, two of them a drum behind them, the music she had specified with the exactness she brought to everything that mattered. Not the Protestant hymns she'd spent 60 years tolerating at other people's funerals, but the music from a country she'd carried inside her for 83 years without ever returning to see it. Music that moved faster than grief and louder than loss and insisted in its tempo that the purpose of the gathering was not to mourn, but to celebrate the fact that the life had happened at all. The brothers revved their engines, 20 of them in formation all at once. The sound that is felt before it is heard, the sound Rafe had been part of for 35 years and was now experiencing from a different position, from the side of it rather than the head of it, and from here it felt not smaller, but differently shaped. Like looking at a mountain from a different angle and finding you've been underestimating one of its faces. Frank and Nora McCallum were returned to the earth beneath the rose bush that Nora had planted the year their son was born, and the fiddles played and the drum kept time, and Phoenix went on existing around them in the way that cities do, without pause, without acknowledgement, with the simple ongoing fact of itself, 1 year. That is the distance between a burial in September and a mourning in September. 365 mornings, each one requiring its own decisions, its own small negotiations between what had been and what was being built. Second Wind Custom Motorcycles occupied a converted garage on the eastern edge of Phoenix, large enough for 6 bikes in various stages of becoming, with 2 hydraulic lifts and a parts organization system that Mason had designed in the 3rd week, and that turned out to be significantly more logical than the one Rafe had intended. He acknowledged this privately and not in so many words. 4 men worked the bays. Brendan Shea, who had rebuilt his first complete engine from components by February and whose torque specifications were now accurate enough that Rafe only spot-checked rather than fully verified. 2 others, Colt and Dex, who had come from circumstances that required a certain kind of trust to be extended before it could be earned back and who had been earning it steadily since January. A 4th younger who was still learning the vocabulary of the work, but who showed up every morning and stayed until the job was done and never once had to be told twice. Mason ran the front, not because Rafe had designed it that way from the beginning, but because Mason had migrated toward it organically, filling the space between the shop and the customers with a fluency that Rafe recognized as genuine skill. He understood people, how to read what they actually wanted as distinct from what they were saying, how to explain a complicated mechanical situation without condescending, how to turn a first-time customer into a repeat one without performing anything. He had put down the performance somewhere along the way, and what was left was the person underneath, and that person was, it turned out, quite good at being around other people. He was 11 months sober. He had called his mother in November. What had been said in that call remained between them and their family as it should. What Rafe knew was that Mason drove to Tucson on the first Sunday of every month to have dinner with his mother, and that he had in the past few months started talking about Ryan in the past tense rather than the middle distance, which was the verbal equivalent of a wound beginning to close. On a Wednesday morning in September, Rafe arrived at the shop at 6:30, an hour before opening, his usual time. He liked the hour before anyone else arrived, the quietness of the space before the work began, the particular quality of a workshop in early morning when everything was in its place and the day's problems were still theoretical. He made coffee, walked the floor, checked the pan head on lift 2 that Brendan was rebuilding for a Scottsdale customer, examined the progress on a 1968 Electroglide that had come in looking like something recovered from a fire and was slowly reassembling itself into something that deserved the name. He sat at the workbench with his coffee and opened the notebook, the blue spiral notebook. Nora's. He'd found it in the drawer of her bedside table in the week after she died, exactly where her letter had said it would be. He had not read it all at once. He'd been reading it in portions a few pages at a time, the way you read something that requires its own kind of preparation. Every entry was dated. Beginning in 1994, 30 years of careful observation. She had noted each accident and its approximate severity. She had noted conversations where he'd repeated himself. She had noted, and this was the one that stayed with him most, a pattern in his anger, described over years from a mother's close and lifelong vantage point. In the early entries, fierce but controlled. By 2010, harder to predict the threshold. By 2015, she had written one sentence that stood alone at the bottom of a page. He stopped himself on Thursday at the Riverside gas incident, but only just. He didn't remember the Riverside gas incident. That was the point. Dr. Owen Marsh had told him at his follow-up in March that the modifications were holding, that the latest imaging showed the progression had slowed significantly. The word he used was meaningfully, which carried weight in the specific context of neurological deterioration. Not stopped, not reversed, but meaningfully slowed, which meant the choices were registering in the architecture of the thing he was trying to manage. 20 years if the trajectory continued. He was 59, 20 years meant 79. Frank McCallum had not made it to 44. He closed the notebook, finished his coffee, heard the door. Sylvie Hartwell came in with 2 cups from the place 2 blocks east because she had learned over the past several months that the coffee Rafe made at the shop was technically coffee in the way that technically was doing a lot of work in a sentence. She set 1 cup in front of him. She had been coming by on Wednesday mornings for 4 months, initially with a manufactured errand, dropping something off, picking something up that both of them understood as what it was, and neither of them named. Now without a reason. Now because Wednesday morning was when she came by. They had eaten dinner together 11 times. Always at the house on Estrella Drive, which Rafe had not sold and did not intend to sell. She had cooked 3 of those times using Nora's recipes, asking about them. How did she season this? What did she add to that, with a curiosity that was not about performing interest, but about actually knowing? He had told her about Nora's pot roast, the specific one, the recipe on an index card in the kitchen drawer, and Sylvie had made it in November from that card. It had been not the same, it was never going to be the same, but it had been its own good thing. That phrase had come to him somewhere around December. Its own good thing, not a replacement, not a forgetting, its own thing with its own weight and particular qualities deserving of its own attention. He drank the coffee she'd brought. The panhead customer is coming in this afternoon, he said. Mason texted me. He also said Brendan needs to be told the timing cover gasket needs replacing before the head goes back on. He's being diplomatic about it because he doesn't want to step on your supervision. Rafe looked at her. He's learning the balance, Sylvie said. He doesn't want to overstep. I'll talk to Brendan. I know you will. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Looked at him directly in the way she had, carrying no agenda bar except the thing itself. How are you? He thought about the question. He gave it the actual consideration it deserved, which was the thing he'd learned to do in the past year. Not deflect it, not manage it, but actually sit with it long enough to produce something true. Better than I expected to be, he said. She nodded. That was enough. She didn't push for elaboration, which was one of the things. After she left, Rafe drove to Estrella Drive. The rose garden in September was at its fullest, the desert heat finally breaking enough at the edges of the season that the roses had the conditions they needed, and Nora's plants responded to the shift with an exuberance that felt, if he let himself read it that way, like a statement. He filled the watering can at the outdoor spigot, the same one with the green handle that Nora had been using since 1987, which still worked because She had replaced the washer inside it every few years and had taught him to do the same when he was a teenager and had complained about the dripping. He started at 7 o'clock. Her time, the time she had always done it before the heat arrived, while the light was still low and the air still carried some memory of the night's relative cool. He moved along the beds the way she had moved along them, slowly attending to each plant, reading what it needed, giving it what it required, and not more, because overwatering was its own kind of damage, and she had told him that more times than he could count. He reached the large bush by the trellis. Frank's trellis, the one built on a Saturday in 1971. He watered around the base carefully, set the can down, crouched and put his hand flat on the soil for a moment. It was warm with the early sun, the same soil he'd pressed down with both palms in September a year ago. He reached into his pocket, the pocket watch. He held it for a moment, feeling the worn brass case, the small dent, the inscription on the back that he didn't need to look at because he had known it by heart since he was 17 years old. Every mile matters. He set the watch on the ground beside the base of the rose bush, not giving it away, just setting it down for a moment, letting it be in the place where what it commemorated had come to rest. He looked at the trellis. He thought about Frank McCallum building it on a Saturday because his wife had mentioned wanting one. He thought about the letter written in block letters in a jail cell in 1979, kept by a woman for 47 years until her son was ready to receive it. He thought about Nora planning quietly for the futures of people who didn't know they were being planned, for using what was left of her time not for her own comfort, but for the architecture of what she was leaving behind. He thought about the shop, about Brendan's hands learning precision, about Mason on the phone with his mother, about the men who came in broken and were learning slowly that brokenness was a condition and not an identity. He thought about a Wednesday morning and coffee and the particular quality of a Tuesday evening with a woman who had been chosen for him by someone who loved him well enough to plan even this. He thought about the clock face he still couldn't draw correctly, about the word that sometimes arrived late, about the 20 years that were available to him if he made the right choices. Not perfect choices, not unambiguous choices, but the right ones, the ones that kept the progression slow and gave the years their proper weight. He picked up the watch, slipped it back into his pocket, stood. The Harley was at the curb. He'd ridden it over at 6:30, taking the surface streets he'd been taking for a year now, not because he'd been told to avoid the highway, but because he'd discovered in the unhurried pace of a man who was no longer running from or toward anything in particular that the surface streets contained more of the actual city, more of its texture, more of what Phoenix actually was when you weren't passing through it at speed. He put on his helmet, straddled the Road King, felt the familiar geometry of it, the machine that had been his partner through everything that still ran true, that he had maintained with the same care he'd always brought to the things that mattered. It would need new tires before winter. He'd scheduled the work for next week. Brendan would do it under supervision. The kid was ready. The engine came alive. He pulled out from Estrella Drive. Not fast, not slow. Just moving at the pace of someone who has somewhere to go and enough time to get there, who has learned finally at 59, which was late but not too late, which was precisely the point, that the road was not something to be conquered or fled across, but something to be inhabited mile by deliberate mile with the full weight of attention it deserved. He rode east toward the shop. The September sun was coming up over the mountains at the edge of the city, turning the sky the particular shade of orange and rose and early morning gold that was specific to this desert, to this improbable city, built in conditions that should not have been hospitable and turned out to be, in their severe and uncompromising way, exactly that. He thought about his mother who had watered her roses every morning at 7 for 46 years. He thought about his father who had written a letter in 1979 that took 47 years to reach its destination and still arrived in time. He thought about the men at the shop who would arrive at 7 and begin the slow, honest work of making broken things whole. He thought about a Wednesday morning and coffee and the particular quality of an evening that had become its own good thing. He did not try to hold all of it. There was too much of it to hold. He just rode. Into the morning, into the city, into whatever number of days remained, each one requiring its own choices, its own attention, its own careful mile of forward motion in the direction of the person he was still at 59 in the ongoing practice of becoming. The pocket watch was warm against his chest. Every mile matters, every single one. The ones going somewhere.